Hey everybody, welcome to Dungeon Brew. We are going to be starting a new series talking about strongholds. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Hey everyone, we're going to be talking about strongholds today on Dungeon Brew. This is something that I have been fascinated by for most of my D&D career. And I have written a ton of information for my players to use, and I've incorporated them in a variety of games where I've tried to do different things with strongholds and, get different classes, or when we were playing in older editions, races as classes, getting them strongholds. So Joshua, will you get us started with a definition of strongholds so that we can get into this conversation?
Yeah, so strongholds are most typically known as a place where old men go to die with a bunch of servants to bury them.
Of course.
No, I think that's actually a Game of Thrones quote. Strongholds are, typically when I think of a stronghold, it's going to be like a building or a collection of buildings that are constructed that you get later on within the course of gameplay. It can be like a fortress, it can be a outpost, it can be a monastery. It's something that's put together where you are becoming a ruler or a leader of multiple different elements that not only generating you income, but also giving you some sort of prestige within the game that you're playing.
Right. So the cool thing for me is that strongholds have been around for a long time. They originally came out in the 1984 companion rules set. And it's older than me. It was one of those that the rules on the player side are very bare bones. Most of it is basically your DM is going to tell you when you can have a stronghold and tell you what you need to do. And then there's a long list of people that you can hire to work in your stronghold, and that's kind of it. And then on the DM side, there are more rules about determining what the population looks like, what taxes are going to be, the extent of your dominion, how you determine whether or not a player should have a stronghold, that type of stuff. But all of it is always centered around name level, which in first edition D&D, this would have been around level 10. When you suddenly become whatever your class name is. So a fighter becomes a lord, a thief becomes a master thief, that type of thing. Which I love class names, by the way. I think that they're great, and I wish that they were always a part of D&D. But this was kind of the progression. But the actual rules when it came to what you're supposed to do, really, at that level, were kind of vague. There were war rules, so you could get into mass warfare, and that was kind of assumed because now you have a fighter with a castle and you could build out an army and you could go engage in warfare. But even that was kind of clunky. And even though, as we established, this is an older rule set, so this isn't really something that we had experience with at the time, from my research, I haven't found a whole lot of people who actually played a lot with this. This was actually very close to your original definition, in that when a player character got to the level where they built their stronghold, that's kind of the end of the player character's adventuring career, and you would reset and you would go through and start playing again.
Yeah, I think that's always been a struggle within D&D, and it could be a struggle of just like the conceptualization on how to continue gameplay or how to balance gameplay once strongholds are being introduced within that, because it kind of changes the framework of the TTRPG.
Right.
You're now managing monetary things, political things, corruption within your stronghold. There's a wide variety of different things you're looking at as a leader, and so it's kind of hard to go out and go dungeon delving when you have this keep that you're having to manage and maintain, make sure there's enough food, that there's enough defense, that you have matters of law and order being handled. It's a whole wide variety of things, and so it seems pretty understandable that at the point that you're now managing a stronghold, you're kind of wiping the slate clean and starting over, going, all right, let's go back to level 1, because this doesn't fit within what our type of gameplay looks like around our table.
Well, and you have to keep in mind, too, that getting to level 10 was actually a significant achievement. And in first edition, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of experience points to get to that point. And it was a slow grind. Oftentimes, games would take a year or more to get to that stage, sometimes 2 years. And from our own experience, oftentimes when we play, most of our campaigns usually last about a year, maybe a little bit more, before we get excited about a new concept and end up moving on to another game anyway. So it kind of felt like a natural stopping point to get to that stronghold level and going, okay, I've played this character through his life or her life. I'm ready to go and start a new one. I'm going to play their child. Or sometimes what would happen is, you would get the stronghold built, and it's like you would build a new adventuring party, and the adventuring party is doing adventures on behalf of the now retired character.
But you're right, though. Having strongholds in-game, if you want to maintain them, can be a real challenge. And that's what we're hoping to focus on in this video, is talking about if you do want to get to that place of building up a stronghold, utilizing it, and not just retiring your characters. How exactly do you do that? And then we're also going to be detailing in this series how you're going to particularly build a stronghold per class. How are you going to individualize it, maybe based on the class that you have? What would those look like from class to class?
Right, and we're going to be, I think we're going to be focusing primarily on 5th edition classes, since that's the popular venue for it. Currently, we have been playing mostly 2nd edition, so a little bit different there, but we'll focus mostly on those character classes. We might even talk about some racial options, so what would a dwarven stronghold look like, or what would an elven stronghold look like, those types of things.
Do we want to talk about maybe the 6 types of strongholds we typically consider?
Sure, yeah. So let's start out with Arcane Strongholds. And these ones are going to be ones that are mostly used for things like, maybe if you're a wizard, a sorcerer, a warlock. You might even get into something like this if you are an Eldritch Knight, like a subclass of fighter that practices magic, or even what is the rogue one?
Arcane Rogue.
Arcane Rogue, maybe.
Yeah.
But any of those that kind of deal with magic, or even a bard. A bard is a really good one. Anyone that deals with arcane magic in a significant way would be interested in those. They're primarily used as a place to research spells, do summoning rituals, have a library, have access to all the magical things that you might need, maybe even enchanting and crafting magic items.
Another one that you might consider would be a mercantile stronghold. These are also pretty popular for rogues and bards, just being able to bring in income and usually a heavy I can't even think of the word I'm looking for. In give me a word, Jonathan.
I'm not helping you out at
excess.
all. Okay.
In excess, bringing in more money in excess than you might with some of the other strongholds. You also sometimes see retired fighters and barbarians take up business from time to time in these, but these again are usually used to like bring in more income a week. Sometimes they can be trade centers or trading posts in some way, and can be really interesting to run within this context.
And that's a very classic trope, right? The retired fighter or barbarian who is now the innkeeper. You see this in Dragonlance. You see this in Forgotten Realms. It's very common to have like the fighter's old weapon up above the bar, and the fighter is still stolid and can wield that weapon in a pinch if he needs to, and blah, blah, blah. So it's very classic. The next one is a military stronghold. Military strongholds are ones that are reserved for most fighting classes. So any class that has a specific aim towards military combat or melee combat of some kind would fit in there. Anywhere from paladins to rangers to fighters to barbarians, and even again some of the archetypes within like the bard, like a blades bard or something like that, might be interested in having a military style stronghold. These would be keeps or fortresses or citadels of some kind. They're usually going to have defensive walls, and they're going to be capable of fielding an army potentially, depending on the size of them. And they're pretty they're a stronghold that, unlike something like a military, or I'm sorry, unlike something like a mercantile stronghold, probably requires permission of some kind or conquering of some kind in order to gain access. The king is not going to allow you to build a fortress on his lands without approval, and so it requires a little bit more of the political acceptance usually to get access to this type of stronghold.
And of course, this is if you're looking at running your campaign within what might be considered a feudal system instead of some other type of government. Military are probably some of the most popular type of strongholds that you see people leaning towards wanting to build. Once you get to that level of gameplay, it very much kind of changes the course of the game, because now you are doing more warlike open field battles with units and armies. That may not be so much of dungeon delving. The next type of stronghold that we will be talking about a little bit in context of the classes is the noble stronghold. This is probably one of my personal favorites. This is one where you have to have a noble title first. It has, again, like that level of prestige that's attached to it. This is typically reserved for paladins or any class that has that noble background. So maybe you have individuals that are the heir to a throne or to a particular or a liege or a particular family within the realm. These ones can earn taxes, which is kind of an interesting concept as well, where they may be taxing their populace. And I imagine a portion of that, again, taxation is going to be going up the chain towards paying their dues towards a king or somebody else in the realm that is at a higher status than you within your stronghold.
Right. I really like the idea of the noble one. It opens up a lot of games because we had talked about how you get into a different type of gameplay when you start with strongholds, and the noble one really opens up that political gameplay quite a bit. So the next one is religious strongholds. So religious strongholds obviously would be things clerics, paladins, any class that has a religious bent, monks potentially, because you can do anything from a monastery to a temple complex or whatever it is that you want to do. They typically are for those devout classes, but you might see a religious stronghold for somebody like a fighter who is very religious and wants to open up something that is giving back to the religious community in some way. So you might have a devout fighter of Torm or something and decide that he wants to open up a religious stronghold of some kind rather than going with the traditional military or mercantile route.
Now, I'll be honest, religious strongholds are probably my second favorite to look at, because they can be commissioned by the king to potentially move fanatics or other preachers into other realms to change the populace belief system by kind of giving them this different dogma to follow. There's many ways wars are won, and through religion can be one of them.
That makes me think of the Civilization when we used to play back and forth, where you would send prophets into other people's lands in order to try and convert their population. That's kind of what I think of when I think of that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of too. It's like, it can be a really fun way of being like, oh, we need you to send 10 of your prophets into our neighbor's land and convert the people.
Yeah,
so they'll overthrow their government.
Start fighting a religious war. It's awesome. All right.
Then the last one is a residence. This is available to all classes, but it's usually in a limited scope compared to the other strongholds. Usually it's like a secondary stronghold. We'll talk about this a little bit, how you have strongholds within strongholds. But this is where you essentially are building a workforce, so to speak, which can kind of give you a benefit to any of the other 5 that we're talking about. Now you might have a militia. Maybe now you have fanatics to train. Maybe you have... what's what I'm looking for? Maybe additional artisans or artifactors within the stronghold that are doing things. So it's giving you that population that you need in order to manage it. And every stronghold at some point is going to need that population of individuals to essentially allow it to flourish.
I like residence actually as a good option as a stronghold if you're trying to do a lower key style stronghold game. So you want the players to continue to be able to engage in the typical dungeon delving and that type of thing that you would see in most games, and residents offer a kind of a background stronghold. It's like, we can go back home and I have a forge built there so that I can, mess with my weapons, or I've added in like these amenities to my residence, and I don't actually have a full stronghold that you would expect, where it's like I have this fortress built with all of this other stuff that I have to manage constantly. It works really well for a more casual style stronghold game rather than some of the more intense ones that are on this list.
And with these, again, we're going to kind of do a plug and play where we look at these different options and the additions that you might have in each one of these categories and how you might apply those to different classes during this series. But one of the things that we also wanted to talk about in the course of this video, which you kind of touched on in the beginning, John, is some of the difficulties of moving into gameplay with Strongholds, which we have definitely had our fair share of roadblocks in trying to play with Stronghold concepts in the course of gameplay, because it does require some buy-in from your players, because it changes the scope of gameplay.
It does.
And one of the things that we've noticed oftentimes is that Strongholds kind of get this glossed over brush with them, where you're just trying to like hurry and manage them and get them out of the way so you can go back to your adventuring or back to your main quest line that you had set up prior to the Stronghold being introduced. And this can really be a challenge. One of the things you'll hear me talking about often in this series is how important it is to make sure that there's a story that's built around the Strongholds creation and function, and making sure that that is intertwining or blending with the story that's already being told.
Yeah, definitely. You have to you mentioned player buy-in, which is definitely important. But you also have to recognize that the scope of play, which we've kind of touched on here and there, is somewhat different. And you don't, if you want to have the Stronghold be significant and meaningful, you almost have to get into the mechanics of that in some way. If you are more interested in maintaining the continuance of this, of the adventures, of the stories, of the other things that are going on, then maybe the Stronghold becomes something that is more of a backdrop. So you end up with residences for your players, or if you're familiar with a lot of the way that Matt Mercer handles Strongholds, it becomes a unified structure for all of the players. They all have like a room within the Stronghold, and it's not really something that's dealt with directly. It's more of just kind of like this place where it's like they go back and visit so they have a safe haven, but it's not really the core aspect of whatever the game is going on at that point.
Yeah, maybe they're called back from time to time to deal with some small business here and there, but it's not really a primary focus of what it is that's going on. I know one of the things that we've seen in the past is that when you have everyone having their own strongholds that's built around their class, and you're giving it attention, chances are a large portion of your gameplay is going to be management of that stronghold in some way. It's almost like playing a video game and being stuck in the menus, and you just spend 3 hours in those menus like organizing everything in your inventory and never actually get to the actual game. It can feel that way, and that's why it's so important to find a way to blend this, which again, I love the idea of having everyone manage the same stronghold, because at least then you're telling the story together and you're not all just waiting for the other person to get done with their portion of the story. Right.
And that becomes kind of like this, like you said, everybody's playing their own game almost at some point. So if you've got 3, 4, 5, 6 players, each one has their own stronghold, and they've got to manage, especially if we're even going back to the 1984, where it's like they have a population, they have to manage taxes, they have to hire people in order to run certain aspects of their stronghold, they have to manage any other quests that might pop up around their stronghold, and suddenly you've got 6 games going on at once, and that can be not only extremely overwhelming for the DM, but it can also be something that becomes less fun for the other 5 players while you're focusing on one player and trying to get them set up with whatever is going on, answer questions, tell them what they can and they can't do based off of their stronghold. So you have to kind of make a decision at some point when you get to the stronghold, or hopefully long before it, about how you want to manage the stronghold in your particular game.
Yeah, and again, it's got to have that player buy-in on what it is that they want to do, and it may be a thing you have to come back to in the midst of it and check in and decide if what is happening is working for everybody, or if you need to change the design of how you're doing it.
Right. So we've talked about a couple of options here, but just kind of briefly to recap, option 1 is obviously you don't use strongholds at all. Option 2 would be potentially that you have a backdrop stronghold for individual players, such as a residence that is not dealt with directly all of the time, and they kind of are allowed to revisit it, but you don't deal directly with things like incomes and payments and other things like that. You just kind of go, that's there and it's fine. Option 3 is there's a shared stronghold. So the shared stronghold is where all of the players are involved in one stronghold, and they might have rooms. They might be involved in a larger stronghold, such as a fortress or citadel, and then they act together to make decisions, almost like a council that rules over it. And then option 4 is they have individual strongholds. And individual strongholds, in that game in particular, your game has to be about the strongholds almost, because if they're significant in any way, then you start to revolve around that. We were kind of spitballing ideas before, and I think it was really interesting, the idea of basically saying, yes, individual strongholds, and those individual strongholds, maybe they're all lords or they're all rulers of some kind, and then they can be on a council together underneath the ruler, which allows for a political transfer. So you have your normal campaign, and it becomes stronghold management in the background, but most of the gameplay is focused on the political aspect of it, which allows them to kind of have their cake and eat it too.
Which I think that sounds really exciting, but I know that there are groups that really don't like that aspect of gameplay. They like to, get out there into the wilds and hack and slash and kill things, and they're about that experience and that treasure and that glory, and they're motivated by other things besides the political elements of the game. You and I both lean towards really enjoying political games. So make sure you have a good conversation with the characters before you decide on which one of those options you want to choose.
And I think one of the options for something like that, and we've done in the past, is transitioning to a hybrid game where it's like you meet some weeks and other weeks you're just basically doing like communications via email, that type of thing, to get into the political intrigue aspects. While allowing people to kind of have their freedom and not necessarily have to sit there for several hours while you're dealing with other players and their imaginations. So,
yeah, and there's also, of course, we played before where a lot of the stronghold management is done behind the scenes in emails back and forth. So the actual gameplay session is focused around gameplay. But again, that depends on who your group is. Not everyone has the freedom to sit around and manage emails and strongholds throughout the week when they're working, taking care of family, etc. So
yeah.
You got to know what you're about. That's what the message is.
Yes, there are a ton of options that come into this, and you just need to pick what's right for you and your group, honestly.
All right, well, we're excited to dive into this series. I think we're starting with Barbarians and their Strongholds, so check that out next week in the video. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Talk to you guys all next time.
Dungeon Brew.